And what I want to do is I want to talk about a variety of different kinds of skepticism about human rights. I'm going to talk about 3 different kinds of skepticism first, just for about 20 or 25 minutes. And then I want to focus on one kind of skepticism, which is based on the doctrine of ethical relativism, the view that morality is in every way relative to cultures and societies. So what I will do is I will lecture for about 20 or 25 minutes, actually be asking questions so we can have some interaction. And then after I talk about these 3 specific varieties of skepticism that I'd like to discuss, I will then ask a set of questions and we'll break up into smaller groups again and then hear presentations about your ideas on these questions. So that's the way this morning will go. So the 3 kinds of skepticism I'd like to discuss at first is about skepticism about human rights. First of all, the Marxist critique of human rights. And second of all, the utilitarian critique of human rights. And third, the feminist and communitarian critique of human rights. So let's take these in order. Many of you are yes.
The second what?
The second critique is the utilitarian critique. Do I need to write these on the board? Yes? Okay. So the first one is Marxist. The second one is utilitarian. And the third is the feminist or communitarian. So these are 3 independent sources of skepticism about human rights. And they're really skepticism about human rights because they're skeptical about rights in general. So the Marxist critique, you may all be familiar with this critique, but what Marx thought was that rights are appropriate only in certain social circumstances. In fact, only in corrupted social circumstances, the circumstances of capitalism. And if what rights do is they protect our individual autonomy, they enable us to assert claims as individuals against the government or against the collective, and sometimes, in fact oftentimes, against the interests of a collective group. And in capitalism, it's perfectly appropriate to have rights because capitalism is based on the pursuit of individual interests, according to Marx. And so rights are the appropriate moral tools in order to facilitate or in order to enable the pursuit of individual interests within a capitalist economy. But of course what Marx thought was that a capitalist economy was a morally corrupt form of economic organization. And what he thought was that when we moved beyond this corrupted form, we would reach a form of social organization that included a form of economic organization in which people were transformed so that we would become much more cooperative individuals and we would not be competitive. And so we would not have the need of rights to assert our individual interests against the interests of others, individuals, and against the interests of a collective. So in that case, Marx's critique of rights can be extended to a critique of human rights because human rights are supposed to be universal rights. They're supposed to be universal rights in 2 senses. One is they are supposed to be possessed by human beings at all times, not just in the 19th or 20th or 21st century, but at all times. and in all places, in all societies. Because human rights are grounded in our humanity. Our humanity doesn't change whether we were born 200 years ago or whether we were born 1,000 years from now. Our humanity, our basic humanity does not change. Our humanity is the basis, is the ground of human rights. Not of all rights, but of human rights. And therefore, if the basis of human rights is unchanging across time, if the basis of human rights is unchanging across societies, it doesn't matter what we look like, it doesn't matter how economically or technologically sophisticated we are. At bottom, we are human beings, and so we share a fundamental set of human rights. At least that's the basic idea behind human rights. So if Marx is correct, then rights, not to mention human rights at all, but just rights, are appropriate only in certain societies under certain circumstances. And so they lack the universality required of human rights. So that was Marx's critique of rights, and so of human rights. Does anybody want to respond to Marx's critique?
It's true.
It's true, huh? It's true. Is it the case that if we were all... Marx makes a number of controversial assumptions in his argument, but let's grant him one assumption. Let's grant that we might, under a gradual process of entering a communist society, let's grant him that we might lose much or all of our competitive nature and become, by nature now, much more cooperative. Would there still be no call for human rights? Would there be any place for rights at all in a society in which we are all very cooperative? I think we need to make a distinction here between whether human rights exist and how often we need to exercise those rights. So imagine a society in which people were not competitive in the way they actually are. They were not egoistic or at all selfish. They were always altruistic. To my view is that in that society, people would still possess human rights. So I disagree with Marx about this. People would still possess human rights, but there would be much less need for people to actually exercise those rights. So, for instance, I think even in that society, people have a right to freedom of conscience. That is, they have an immunity against other people forcing them to believe what these other people want. In the society that Marx was envisioning, other people would not try to coerce you into believing what they believe. Nevertheless, that's compatible with your having a human right.
Provided that there is such a right allowed. Like in a communist society in the Soviet Union, that was not allowed. There was
well,
one state.
It's not clear whether the Soviet Union was anything like the communist society that Marx envisioned, of course, right? So when I'm talking about a communist society, I'm not talking about any actual society like North Korea or Cuba or the Soviet Union that calls itself communist. I don't think Marx would, excuse me, I don't think Marx would have recognized those societies as genuinely communist in his sense. In any event, that's actually not so important. What's important is if we imagine a society that is much better than any of those societies I just mentioned in terms of encouraging altruism and getting rid of competition and fostering a sense of communal harmony, even there I think it's plausible to say that people have human rights. It's just that they don't have to exercise, those rights aren't threatened nearly as much as they are in a capitalist society. So that's my criticism of Marx's skepticism about human rights. Does anybody want to offer any criticism of what I've just said before I move on to the next.
That's presumption.
Excuse me?
It's a presumption, of course.
What specifically is the presumption?
That still human rights will be there.
Yeah, I don't. Well, I think that's.
We assume that, for example, we here have a communist society. I think you can say. So as a small communism group that we have, everything is great. We are friendly, don't compete, and of course, there is a leader of the group. He can direct us a little bit, but he's not intrusive. We are fed. We are given what we need according to our needs. We can provide what we can provide, so forth. So it's fine. I agree that it's possible. We have human rights here.
You have the freedom of speech, for instance. That's right. It's just so I think there's a difference. I think Marx's mistake. I'll summarize it this way. And since nobody wants to criticize me, I'll just summarize it, and then, Tyrus, you can say something. And that is that I think that Marx believed that there is a possible society in which there is no need to assert your rights. And if there's no need to assert your rights do not exist. And that's, I think, I'm willing to allow that there's a possible society in which you do not need to assert your rights. But I deny that it follows that therefore those rights do not exist. Yeah.
I think Marx was too idealistic and superficial over seeing these the rights in communist society, in this ideal society. He saw this problem only from the view of social and economic problems. But every right is a result of social conflicts and of our needs. And even in this society, where there will be no conflicts between different social groups, there will be, in any time, there will be rights. And so it was very superficial on this problem.
Because there are many sources of conflict. It's not just economic.
And he saw only one group of conflict.
If you take 5 chairs from here, there will be less chairs, and people will be competing for chairs. If you give everyone 5 minutes to talk, not everybody will be able to talk within 25 minutes. So if you change circumstance, if you will not be given some food, we will have to work for food. There will be some people who will work, some people will not work. So there will be some other condition will change. Some people will be claiming something, claim as part of the rights, you said?
Yeah.
Type of the rights. So changing conditions will change the situation, and some rights will be asserted.
Yeah. So I think it's plausible to say that in any social circumstance in which there is conflict, there is the potential and the need to exercise one's rights. And then the question is, can there ever be a society that is completely free of conflict? No. Okay. Let's move on to the second criticism of human rights, and this was given by the first version of this criticism. There's actually a very long tradition of this criticism, about 200 years now. But the first version of this criticism is perhaps the most famous, and this was offered by Jeremy Bentham. Is this a familiar name, or should I write this? Okay.
It's a
familiar name. Okay. So Jeremy Bentham wrote he wrote the first extended systematic defense of utilitarianism in 1781, an introduction to the principles of morals and legislation. He also wrote a fairly short pamphlet called Anarchical Fallacies, Fallacies of Anarchy. And in that he developed a strong critique of rights. They weren't called human rights in 1781, they were called natural rights. And what Bentham said, this has become famous at least in the English literature on rights, Bentham called natural rights nonsense on stilts. Do you know what's the Russian for stilts? Nonsense on stilts. That itself is a sort of nonsensical idea. But what Bentham was trying to do is to say that natural rights, human rights in our terms, are complete nonsense. Why are they complete nonsense? Because because natural rights are moral rights. Bentham was thinking about these as moral rights, not legal rights. And what Bentham said was that the entire basis of morality is happiness and suffering. We have only one fundamental moral duty, according to Bentham, and according to most utilitarians, and that one fundamental duty is to maximize happiness, and when we can't do that, to minimize suffering, or minimize unhappiness.
Is it the same? Maximize happiness and minimize
unhappiness? It's not the same thing, so what we can say is there's a fundamental principle which is to maximize happiness and minimize unhappiness. Okay. Now what Bentham said, and he was correct about this, is that rights will sometimes prevent us from doing this. Whether they're natural rights or other more ordinary moral rights, rights are designed to do what American legal philosopher Ronald Dworkin has called, rights are trumps. And he took this idea of a trump from the card game of bridge. You want to translate trump? Okay. So what Ronald Dworkin in the 1970s called rights as trumps, what he meant was this. When you do a utilitarian calculation about an action, you ask of an action, how much happiness will this action bring? How much unhappiness will it bring? And what the utilitarian says is, you must pick that action of all the actions available to you right now. You must pick that action which maximizes happiness or minimizes unhappiness. And what Dworkin said is that that's false, because sometimes actions that maximize happiness or minimize unhappiness violate people's rights, and we have to respect people's rights. What rights do is they serve as trumps, as things that are more powerful than calculations of happiness and unhappiness. So, for instance, if it would make a lot of people happy to shut me up and to violate my right to free speech, what the utilitarian says is that I must be shut up. Now, of course, my unhappiness has to be factored into the calculation. But if many, many people will be made happy by shutting me up, then my unhappiness it counts, there's a little bit of that, but there's a lot of happiness on the other side. In that case, the morally right thing to do is to prevent me from speaking and to shut me up. And this kind of case can be played out in many different circumstances in which many people will be happy if the rights of a small number of people are violated. Just think about many cases in which there are small minority groups in the society that are oppressed. And the happiness of the large majority in that society, to some extent, depends on the continued oppression of the minority group. Now, according to the utilitarian, everyone's happiness counts, and everyone's happiness counts equally. That's another famous phrase of Bentham's. But when you calculate everyone's happiness and unhappiness, it can happen that the interests of the minority are outweighed by the interests of the majority. The problem then is that what rights very often do is to protect the interests of the minority against the majority. In so many societies around the world, we see the same pattern. The majority wants to unjustly threaten the interests of the minority. The majority does not want to treat the interests of a minority as important in their own right. And if we are to side with the utilitarian on this matter, members of the majority will often be morally right to do that. And so, what someone like Dworkin, who is a critic of utilitarianism, says is that utilitarianism fails to accommodate the idea of a right. And what someone like Jeremy Bentham says is, you're absolutely right, Dworkin. Jeremy Bentham would be speaking from his grave because he's been dead for 200 years. But Bentham would say, you're absolutely right. Utilitarianism has no room to accommodate the idea of rights, much less human rights. And for Dworkin, what he says, and many others, what they say is, so much the worse for utilitarianism. Okay. Now, I just wanted to draw your attention to this very important debate in contemporary ethical theory between those who defend the existence of rights and human rights on the one side, and utilitarians on the other side. There's no way that we could try to resolve this debate this morning, because we could spend another month together, and that would be a lot of fun. Maybe for me, I don't know for you, but and we still would not be any closer. Probably, well, we'd be somewhat closer. I think we can make progress, but we'd still be probably deadlocked in this debate. So I don't want to try to resolve this debate. My own sympathy is not with the utilitarian in this matter, but I'm not going to try to provide a whole set of arguments against utilitarianism because, well, we just don't have time to do that. But I thought my presentation here would be incomplete if I didn't at least make mention of this very important source of skepticism about rights and human rights. Okay. Yes.
One question. So why utilitarianism does not work in our countries?
Why does it not work?
Yes. In a sense, like police, persecutorial people, according to this theory, they will have to lessen the sufferings of people, but they will do sufferings to people.
Of course, yes. What you're asking is not really a philosophical question, it's a sociological question.
It is a philosophical question because this is their philosophy. And this philosophy contradicts to what Bentham has said.
But that's why I say it's not a philosophical question, because you're not asking which theory is the correct theory, you're asking why don't the police employ the correct moral theory? Well, that's a sociological, that's a sociological question. There is a philosophical question, and that is utilitarianism the correct moral theory in the first place?
Right.
Of course, many people believe that utilitarianism is not the correct theory because it does not allow a place for human rights. But even if you were convinced that utilitarianism is the correct theory, then you ask, well, Mr. Police Officer, why aren't you trying to minimize unhappiness? Why are you instead trying to actively create unhappiness? The police officer might say, well, because it makes me happy to make you unhappy. But that's not a philosophical answer. That's a psychological explanation. Yes, Sergey?
I don't think we give a right or favorable interpretation of utilitarianism. We don't say human rights are bad. Actually, they use different. They're not so flat. Just if we can kill a person, if it's better for us, it is really not a utilitarianism because they use a really great bunch of arguments, taking account of future, of future interests of all the groups.
That's right.
And we can have utilitarian accounts and utilitarian justification of human rights. And maybe we can justify the Dworkin's position from utilitarian point. So I don't think utilitarian in that kind is always an opposite to the concept of human rights.
Well,
I don't think this is true of utilitarianism.
I think that utilitarians are, there is a small number of utilitarians who try to justify human rights, but I actually don't want to take the time to talk about that small group. The majority of utilitarians, however, cannot make sense of human rights. What they can do is, because, as you say correctly, that what utilitarians tell us to do is maximize happiness and minimize unhappiness in the long run, not just in the short term, but in the long run and for everyone, that very often what utilitarians will say is that the actions that we recommend are the same actions that someone like Dworkin would recommend. So we will not be violating what most people think of as people's rights. That's what most utilitarians say. However, most of them will also admit that there will be some circumstances in which, in order to maximize happiness in this world, over the long run, we will have to do things that violate people's rights. And in that case, what the utilitarian says is, you must do it then, because unhappiness will be minimized and happiness will be maximized.
Yesterday we were talking about absolute rights. Are human rights absolute? Were we utilitarians then, when we say they're not absolute?
Utilitarians certainly deny the existence of absolute rights.
But
yes,
when
certainly.
we deny the absolute character of human rights, are we utilitarians?
No,
Why
not necessarily.
Why not?
Because there are many different theories that deny the absolute nature of human rights, including Dworkin, for instance.
Okay.
So Dworkin does not believe in absolute rights, but he believes in many rights. And what he says is that in cases in which what he says about rights, including human rights, is this: that do the utilitarian calculation. If the utilitarian calculation calls on us to violate a right, that's not automatically a good case to violate the right. In fact, in most cases, we should honor the right and violate the utilitarian requirement.
Why should we respect rights? Can you explain Dworkin's position on that point?
Actually, I don't want to explain his position, because I think that will take us too far afield. I'd rather focus on this last criticism and then write some questions up and give you an opportunity to talk amongst yourselves rather than just continuing to lecture to you. So I want to relatively quickly develop this feminist and communitarian critique. Oftentimes feminists are communitarians. Sometimes they're different. There are some communitarian writers who don't identify themselves as feminists. But the basic criticism is this, that for both feminists and communitarians, the criticism is much like Marx's criticism. Namely that what rights do is they are moral tools for morally corrupt societies. What the feminist critic says is that moral rights have been developed as a patriarchal idea. Is that the same in Russian, patriarchal? Yeah. As a patriarchal idea. Rights are patriarchal tools because what rights do is they allow us to assert our authority over other people, allow us to assert our individuality. They are tools to confer power over others. And instead, what we ought to do, as feminists see it, is we ought to reduce the emphasis on individuality. We ought to reduce the emphasis on being aggressive people who assert our claims against other people. We ought to be much more community-minded, and this, of course, is where the communitarian critics of rights come in as well. That the emphasis on individual importance and individual interests should be minimized. Feminists often see as the appropriate model for moral relations the mother-child model, which is one of caring and mutual love rather than the assertion of one person's interests against the interests of another. It's the assertion of, it's not an assertion at all, it's a nurturing relationship. It's a relationship of love and care in which people do not seek to separate themselves from one another, but come into communion with one another. And the thought is that what rights allow us to, what rights are for, is to assert our entitlements primarily, not entirely, of course, but primarily, especially when we're talking about human rights, they allow us to assert our entitlements against one another rather than enhancing or fostering an attitude of mutual care and respect. So that's the criticism there of the feminist and the communitarian criticism of human rights. What many communitarians, well, some communitarians are also Marxists. There are some communitarians who are not, but who say nevertheless that the culture of rights is one that breaks down community. It instead fosters aggressive individuality at the expense of social cooperation. What do people think of this critique?
It's true.
Nonsense.
It's true, it's nonsense. Maybe somewhere in between is the truth.
In one way,
Thoughts?
make a position. Is that
You may, but I'd be interested if anyone else has something to say about this.
that's fair.
Yeah. Okay, Sergey, nobody does, so.
Well, we could say that human rights they put bars between people, but still this is the bridges between people. Because when I'm free, when I'm guaranteed my interests, my values, and so I have a position, I have a context to communicate with one another. So we can also consider human rights as a basis for community. So this is the point that communitarian, I think, do not see.
I think that's very plausible. I have a criticism of this feminist communitarian line myself. And let's just think right now about the feminist critique of rights, which has been very prominent since the late 1970s. My critique of this is partly conciliatory and partly critical. I think that certainly there's something very important about seeing ideal moral relations in terms of mutual care rather than mutual competition. But here's where I'm critical, and that is that I think that what in many ways has been most important to the cause of feminism over the last 30 years is precisely the existence of human rights. And what is so problematic about sexism, about regarding women as moral inferiors just because they are women, what is so problematic about sexism is that the sexist denies women their human rights. What sexists try to do is to deny women the equal right to political participation, for instance. To deny women the equal right to pursue their own interests rather than be told by their husbands what they must do. The deepest problems about sexism can be remedied by the assertion of human rights. It might be, as with Marx, that in a perfectly ideal society in which we all are treated with respect, that women will no longer have to assert their rights against men who want to encroach on those rights, against men who want to regard women as second-class citizens. But we are very far from that sort of ideal society, of course. And so I think that perhaps the most powerful tool for feminists to employ in order to argue for full equality of women is the concept of a human right. And in fact, some feminists, some liberal feminists, such as Martha Nussbaum, have made precisely this argument and have said that the feminist critique of rights is mistaken. What feminists need is to rely on the notion of rights in order to claim, rightly, that that women are fully human and as such deserve all the rights that men have traditionally enjoyed. So that's my criticism of the feminist critique of rights, and we can make the same kind of argument against the communitarian, though I won't spend any time doing that because I've already spoken for 15 minutes longer than I wanted to. So what I'd like to do now is I'd like to ask you a set of questions and then to invite you to, what I'd like you to do now is get into the same groups, that's right, the very same groups you have been in, unless you think that some of you shy people think, I've become more assertive over the last 2 days, I'll move into the middle group. Or maybe some of you in the middle group think, I've become more assertive, I'm going to move into the assertive group. Maybe some of you in the assertive group have decided, you know what, these guys are too assertive for me, I'm moving over here. So, however you want it, please move into those groups while I write these questions on the board. Tolerance is to provide liberty for practices that you do not yourself endorse or agree with. At least in English, the idea of tolerance, one does not tolerate things one completely agrees with. One tolerates things that one does not agree with. So in that case, you're also right, of course, Lavik, that tolerance can be a personal character trait as well. People can be more or less tolerant. But when it comes to actions and policies, we speak of policies or actions as tolerant only in those cases in which, say, if it's a government action or a government policy, only in cases in which the government is allowing an action that it does not approve of. Otherwise, there is no call for tolerance. Okay, let's take a look at these questions in order now. Are human rights dependent on culture? In one straightforward way, the answer has to be no. Although I know a number of you said yes. Let me explain this one way in which the answer must be no. Human rights are by definition universal rights. They are by definition rights had by all human beings, no matter which culture they are in. So if you say of a certain right that it is only it exists only relative to a culture or a society, then by definition that right cannot be a human right. Because what that means is that those in different cultures lack that right. But if someone has a right in only one culture but not in another culture, then that is not a universal right. If it is not a universal right, it cannot be a human right. Now, I think there was some disagreement about this. I know there was some disagreement about this, and this is my diagnosis of that disagreement. It's something I think I mentioned yesterday, but I'm not sure. I think we do need to distinguish between two things. One is the existence of a right, including a human right, and the other is the recognition of the right. And when a number of people spoke and said that human rights are dependent on culture, I think what they meant, but you can correct me if I'm mistaken, if I've misinterpreted you, but I think what was meant there is the following claim, namely, that some rights are not recognized, are not acknowledged in certain cultures, but in other cultures they are. That is a factual claim, and I have no disagreement with that claim. Of course, some societies do not acknowledge or recognize certain rights, while other societies do. But if a right is truly a genuine human right, then by definition it must be moral. So what we can say is, for instance, with the right to, I believe, for instance, there is a right to freedom of religious commitment. And it's a fact that some societies do not acknowledge or recognize that right. In some societies, you are forced to be religiously committed in only one way. You do not have freedom of religious commitment. You do not have control over your religious position, but rather the society dictates that control. My analysis of what happens in that society is that that society is violating a human right. So what I would like to say of that society is this, that there is a human right to freedom of religious commitment in that society, but that human right is not acknowledged or recognized in that society, and is also, in fact, violated in that society. So my own view is that when we understand the universal nature of a human right, that the answer to this question has to be no, in the primary sense I just explained. Now, there is a way in which we can allow that human rights are dependent on culture, but this is a secondary sense, and this is what I have in mind. Namely, that the specific ways in which people exercise their rights can be culturally dependent. So, for instance, in some cultures, certain religions are just unheard of. When you exercise your right to religious commitment, no one in that culture is Jewish, for instance, or Confucian. Okay. But in other cultures, of course, in Israel, many people are Jewish. In China, many people are Confucian, but in other cultures not. So the specific ways in which human rights are exercised can depend on culture, but the existence of a human right does not depend on culture. That's my view. Does anyone want to criticize me?
Sure.
Okay.
We are talking about different things. I'm not sure that.
Do you want to criticize the same thing? No? Let's talk about the same thing.
No,
Do you want to criticize that?
I'm talking about your position.
Okay.
You see, you're saying that human rights are everywhere. They just exist. And we have to choose, do we recognize it or not? But our position of ours was different. We, in different cultures, we have different views of humans, of their roles, of the traditions, and we can choose to not. We can think human rights are exist or not exist. So this is not the thing that they are everywhere, but we just choose it to recognize or not, or we choose to recognize one form or the other. Our point is different. Human rights is a social construct, social product. So that's why it depends on society. And it's not something that is natural. So this is the different point.
Okay, so that point commits you to ethical relativism.
Sure.
To the view that moral truths are all relative to individual societies. If I have time, I'm going to criticize ethical relativism after I present my views about the other questions. If I don't have time, I will still criticize ethical relativism, but I'll do it over lunch or to anyone who wants to talk to me about it. Okay. Okay, so the second question, do human rights require God? Remember the argument that Slavic nicely reproduced for an affirmative answer, for saying that yes, human rights require God. Why? Because human rights are natural rights. They are had by human nature. And natural rights require natural laws. And natural laws require God as their author, as their lawmaker, as their legislator. So, therefore, human rights require God's existence. My own view is that this is not true. And that's because I challenge the third step of the argument that I have just mentioned. I do not believe that natural laws require God. Of course, it is part of the tradition, it's part of the natural law tradition to introduce God as the author of natural law, but I don't see why God must be the author. Now, of course, many people made the correct claim that God means different things to different people. So the sort of God I'm talking about is the traditional Western Judeo-Christian conception of God as an all-powerful creator of the universe, creator of everything. An omnipotent and all-powerful person who is also omniscient, that is all-knowing, and morally perfect. That's the sort of God I'm imagining, because that's the sort of God that was at the heart of the natural law tradition, that continues to be at the heart of the natural law tradition. And I think at bottom, the idea behind the claim that natural law requires God, the underlying idea is this: every law requires a lawmaker. That's the view. Every law requires a lawmaker. So if there are any moral laws that specify are human rights, for instance, then those moral laws require a lawmaker as well. Now here's the thought, and I know Sergei and members of your group may not like this, but here's the thought now, and that is that human beings are not fit to make moral law because we are all imperfect. Every single one of us, myself certainly included, we have very limited knowledge. We are not perfectly impartial. Sometimes our emotions make us unreasonable and irrational. Whenever we human beings come together to make law, the laws we make are products of compromise and imperfection. And therefore, we are not fit to make the moral law. So, remember that underlying assumption I mentioned 1 minute ago, since every law must have a lawmaker, and human beings are not fit to be that the lawmaker of morality, there is only one other candidate for the job, and that's God. Hold on, Farhad, just a sec. This is a very familiar line of reasoning. I reject it. Okay? I don't accept this line of reasoning. Because the line of reasoning basically says this: there are only two possibilities about the origins of morality. One is human beings made up morality. Morality is just a social construct, as Sergei put it. Or the other possibility is that morality is made up by God. I think there's a third possibility. No one made up morality. We discovered what's right and wrong, but we did not invent it. I know many of you will think, that's crazy, Russ. That's the last crazy thing I'm going to tolerate out of your mouth. Okay, but I have 10 more minutes, so I'm going to say a few more crazy things. But I can't defend this idea, of course, that there is this third option, except by way of an analogy. And that is, suppose that you do not believe in the God of the sort I've just described. Suppose you do not believe in a perfect, all-powerful, all-knowing God, the traditional God of Western religion, Western monotheistic religion. Okay. In that case, do you believe that there are laws that are universal and objective? I bet the answer is yes. These are scientific laws and laws of mathematics and logic. There are laws of physics. Did anyone create those laws of physics? If you are an atheist, then you believe the answer is no. But look, human beings didn't create those laws. But if you're an atheist, you don't believe that God created them either. So you believe in the existence of objective, universal laws that have no author. And myself, I do not believe that moral laws are scientific laws. I don't believe that they are empirical laws. But I do believe that they are objective and universal laws. All I want to say right now, because I cannot give a full argument for this, I know that right now, but all I want to say is I want to introduce the possibility for your reflection that moral laws are like these other laws in the sense that they are objective, universal, but do not need an author, do not need a lawmaker. If you are religious and you are tempted to say this, well, no, the laws of physics and the laws of chemistry and geology, all these scientific laws, they do need an author, a lawmaker. God made up our universe, and so God made up those laws. And then I invite you to reflect on the possibility of the laws of logic, where even most theologians, most religious philosophers believe that God is constrained by the laws of logic. God did not invent those laws, for instance, the law of non-contradiction, but these laws are eternal and objective and universal, and yet they have no author. I have not proven that moral laws are like this. Okay. What I want to do is just open the possibility in your minds that moral laws are indeed like this, and that there is at least some argument that a defender of a yes answer to this question, there's some further argument that that defender needs to supply, because the defender of a yes answer to this question was relying on the following thought. if there are natural moral laws that tell us what human rights we have, God must have been the lawmaker of those laws. And that depends on the view that every law requires a lawmaker. And that is the claim, the underlying claim I've just been trying to criticize. Does anyone want to criticize me about that or ask a question about that? Taras.
If every human being, if every social group or every society will define its natural law, then will be no universal law.
That's right.
And historically, culturally, so there is some contradiction in the words.
Okay, what I would say about that is the following: that we need to distinguish between what each individual identifies as the moral law and what each culture together identifies as the moral law and the true or correct moral law. So I think that there is a difference myself. And someone, your group, I forget, you made the very interesting remark about the history of science in response to this third question. I think that was a really excellent point, and I'd like to borrow that point right now to help explain my reply to Taras. My thought is that when you look at the number of different moral systems that individuals and cultures have developed, I come to the following conclusion. Some of those systems are mistaken. Now, maybe none of those systems is completely mistaken, but each of those systems probably contains at least one mistake. And that, to me, I find that very convincing because I think, when I look at myself, for instance, I don't have full confidence in my own moral opinions. I know that some of the beliefs I have about morality, but also about other things, but let's just stick with morality, I know that some of the things I believe about what's right and wrong, about which rights I have and which rights other people have, about the limits of toleration. We can't tolerate everything, for instance. Some of my beliefs on these matters are mistaken. I don't know which ones. If I did, I would give them up, right? But I have this higher order belief about my specific moral beliefs, and I know some of them are wrong. Why? Because I know that I have a limited perspective. I'm just one human being after all. But in that sense, I am no different from anybody else. Everyone is just one human being with a limited perspective. They don't know all the relevant facts. They aren't perfectly rational. They aren't perfectly open-minded. No one has all the intellectual virtues to a perfect degree. And what that means is that everyone is bound to make some mistakes. And it's no different with individuals or cultures. When you put a group of imperfect people together and you form a culture, it's not that you're going to get perfection at the end. You will get imperfection as well. Different cultures will embody different imperfections. So although certainly it's true that different cultures have identified, have come up with, have produced different moral codes, I think that nevertheless it's possible for them to be mistaken. I think it's possible for my own culture to be morally mistaken. I'm quite sure it is. I'm quite confident that some things that American culture stands for are mistaken. But there's no need just to pick on America. I know it's popular, it's easy to do. But it's the same, we can say the same thing with regard to other cultures as well, that they make mistakes as well. Yeah, go ahead.
So the main question is then, who is the subject to decide the mistakes or the
Excellent.
mistakes?
That, of course, that's...
The subject has to be the most powerful force in the world. Political, economical, cultural.
Yeah.
And this force also will have some mistakes.
Yeah.
In its own.
You're right. But I think that is exactly the right question to ask, but I think, in fact, that it's two questions, not one. Here's one version of the question. Given the existence of moral disagreement within a culture, of course, no culture is completely homogeneous. There is moral disagreement within culture, but there is also moral disagreement, of course, in between cultures. So you ask, so if everyone is imperfect, who is going to decide which rights we have? What principles are morally correct and what principles are morally incorrect? I think that there are two ways to understand that question. The first way is, as in a practical sense, we must act. Governments must act in some way. They must defend and develop certain policies. Who is going to do it? And the answer is that within every society, the government will do that. And the government in practice is going to make law and enforce it. But there's a second version of this question, which is that given the existence of so much moral disagreement, whose opinion has the final authority to determine what truly is right and wrong? And my answer to that question is no one has that authority. No, in the following sense, I'm sorry, I have to make another distinction. No one has the authority in this sense, namely that no one's say-so makes it so. That's very colloquial, so I know it's probably not. How would you translate what I've just said, Sergey?
Please repeat what you just said.
No one's personal, okay, I can put it a different way. No one's personal opinion absolutely determines what is right and wrong. That, however, each of us must, of course, think for himself or herself and try to figure out what's right and wrong. That is part of what it is to be a human being.
Russell, but you want to say that there is a wrong and right.
I do want to say there is a wrong and there is a right.
What's the basis for it? We need to discover it, you want to say.
Of course, yes.
But
so this is
still wrong and right.
There is still wrong and right. So in the example of the German woman that Slavic gave, she was murdered. She wasn't just killed; she was murdered. Her killing was unjustified. That's the definition of a murder. It was an unjustified killing. Now, of course, some people believe that it was justified. And this takes us to this third question. Because, of course, some people will disagree. Her family thought that they were justified in killing her. And my claim is that they were wrong about that. Now, can I prove to them that they are wrong? Probably not. They probably will not be persuaded by the arguments I can give. I can give arguments. I don't have to just stand there and pound my fist and say, no, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong. I can give arguments about that. And those arguments will probably rely on considerations of human rights. Not all of the arguments, but some of the arguments will. But what I want to say now about this third question is this. The fact that there is very strong, persistent, long-standing disagreement about something is compatible with there being a universal truth of the matter. And I'm sorry, I don't know your name. Andrei. What Andrei said, if that's maybe not a good pronunciation, is absolutely correct. We have examples from the history of science, for instance, in which someone develops an idea that many, many people disagree with. That idea was correct. Now you might say in response to that example, well, we know that idea is correct because 50 years later we now all agree. But in fact, there are cases in which we continue to disagree about issues in science and in religion and in philosophy, and yet there is a universal truth. So, for instance, scientists still disagree about whether the universe is fundamentally determinate or indeterminate. Someone like Einstein, who was pretty smart, he thought that the universe was determinate. And there are still scientists, although a minority of scientists, who believe that at bottom, everything in the universe operates according to deterministic laws. And then there are, of course, the majority of scientists, theoretical physicists, who believe that it does not. But this is still an ongoing disagreement. What I want to say is there is a fact of the matter. I don't know what it is. Maybe nobody does right now. But there is a fact of the matter. The universe either is or is not determinate. Let me take one other example. Is there a God of the sort I just spoke about? Is there a creator of the universe who is all-powerful, all-knowing, and morally perfect? Billions of people in this world think that the answer to that question is yes. And millions of people in this world think that the answer to that question is no. And this question has been debated for hundreds of years. And here's my guess. I'm not going to live to find out, but my guess is this question will be debated for the next many hundreds of years. And perhaps the point at which the human race becomes extinct, we will still be disagreeing about this. But there is an objective truth about this question. Either that sort of God does exist or does not exist. Yes, Slavic.
And that is only because you believe so.
No.
Yeah,
On the contrary, absolutely not. Oh, there are two questions. One, does God exist? Two, can I prove an answer to that question?
How?
Do not confuse these questions. They're different questions. What I'm saying right now is this, and this is a familiar point from philosophy of science, for instance, that our theory is underdetermined by our evidence. What's the word for underdetermination? Our theory is underdetermined by our evidence. We have evidence in this world and about whether God exists. Some people take that evidence to support their theory that God exists. Some people take that evidence as a basis for arguing that God does not exist. We may never be able to prove it one way or the other, but there is an objective truth. Either there is such a being or there isn't. So there is this metaphysical question. Does such a being exist? And then there is an epistemological question. Can we prove an answer to that question? These questions are separate. We may not be able to prove an answer to a question, and this is and yet the question may have an objectively correct answer. And this is very important in ethics, because in ethics it's very difficult to come up with excuse me, just a second. In ethics it's very difficult to come up with a final proof that we have human rights, for instance. Or if you accept human rights, that we have a specific right that some societies may reject. We may not be able to prove to other people that there are these rights. But that is compatible with their really existing. How much in this world are we able to prove? Very, very little. But we have many, many justified beliefs that go beyond proof. And a belief in human rights can be one of them. I am out of time. So if you want to talk to me about anything I've just said, or about this last question, just come talk to me during lunchtime or during our break this afternoon. Well, is it
5 minutes? Could be.
It's fine with me. Is it okay with you, or what do you want?
5 minutes time is okay.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Okay. Just 1 second. I would like to offer an opportunity for those who have not yet had a chance to speak to ask a question right now, if anyone would like to, before I recognize those who have already asked questions. Would anyone like to ask? Yes, Andre.
Your arguments against ethical relativism.
You want to hear those arguments? Okay. In 5 minutes? All right. I have 6 arguments in 5 minutes.
Maybe just to name it.
Okay. So one thing. Okay, I'll forget. One argument I've mentioned already, namely that every human being is fallible, that is capable of making mistakes, is imperfect with regard to their knowledge. Ethical relativism makes moral truth based on human agreement. But humans are imperfect, therefore their moral agreements will be imperfect. So ethical relativism makes the ultimate standard of moral truth agreement within a society. Different societies have different agreements, therefore truth is different in each different society. But my claim is that the ultimate standard of truth should not be based on imperfection. And yet ethical relativism makes the standard of truth, moral truth, based on imperfection. That's one argument. A second argument is that if ethical relativism is correct, every society's moral code is equally good. But I believe that some moral codes, some social codes, are not as good as others. No, I believe that no society's moral code is perfect. That's also something when ethical relativists will say is, for each society, that moral code is perfect. Because that code is the ultimate moral authority within that society. If a different society has a different moral code, one society's code is not better or worse, it's just different. My view is that the moral code in certain societies is better than the moral code in other societies. That's not possible if ethical relativism is true. Ethical relativism is a doctrine of moral equivalence. Every social code is equally good, and I think that's a problem. There's, thirdly, the problem of conservatism. I believe that social reformers are often correct. They are not always correct. Sometimes social reformers want to move society in a way that is bad, I believe. But sometimes social reform is good. Ethical relativism cannot allow for that, because what ethical relativism says is that whatever the society ultimately stands for is correct. And therefore, by definition, if you are an iconoclast, what's the Russian word for that?
Iconoborец.
If you are an iconoclast, you are acting immorally. If you are acting in a way that is contrary to the deepest ethic of your society, then according to ethical relativism, you are acting immorally, because the moral code just is the deepest beliefs of your society. So if ethical relativism is true, all social reformers are mistaken. It's not the case that all social reformers are mistaken, and therefore ethical relativism is false. That's my third argument against ethical relativism. My last argument, I'll give just one more argument, and that is an argument that is a bit paradoxical. 5 minutes ago, I was talking about how difficult it might be to gain moral knowledge. If ethical relativism is true, it's too easy to get moral knowledge. If ethical relativism is true, this is all you need to do to get moral knowledge. All you need is to know what your society really believes. Because what your society really believes is the ultimate moral truth, according to ethical relativism. But I think that moral knowledge is actually more difficult to get. And there is a virtue in doing what is difficult. That's what we do as philosophers. We get philosophical knowledge, including moral knowledge. It's not easy. It's difficult. But if ethical relativism were correct, it would be very easy to get moral knowledge. All we would need to do is we would need to stop doing philosophy and start doing sociology. We would need to take very sophisticated polls and find out what our society really believes. Because by definition, according to ethical relativism, by definition, whatever our society stands for is morally correct. So if our society stands for the oppression of women, if our society stands for enslaving ethnic or religious minorities, then if you try to fight on behalf of women, if you try to fight on behalf of those enslaved minorities, you are acting immorally. To me, that is a moral code that I cannot accept. And that is an implication of ethical relativism. That's why I don't accept ethical relativism. 5 minutes or less. You got it. Let's have some lunch. Okay. And thank you very much. Thank you very much. With regard to the relationship between human rights and tolerance, my view is that there are a number of human rights, and they require tolerance on the part of governments and other individuals. But in the context of the discussion today, the point I really want to bring across, which is more controversial than the point I've just made, is that those who defend different versions of ethical relativism actually have great trouble defending the value of tolerance. Oftentimes, ethical relativism is defended because people think that it is the only view about the nature of morality that can support the value of tolerance. But in fact, just the opposite is true. If each society gets to decide for itself what is right and wrong, and if each society has, if each society's moral code is truly the ultimate standard of morality for action done within that society, then if, as many societies are, if a society is deeply intolerant, if it stands for racism or sexism, then within that society, actions that are sexist or racist are morally proper actions. And if, as many societies have been, a society is deeply intolerant, in that case, if ethical relativism is correct, then within that society, it is right to be intolerant and wrong to be tolerant. And so I think, myself, that tolerance is a very great value. But the only way to defend its importance is to say that tolerance is valuable not only for those societies that already accept the importance of tolerance, but especially for those societies that reject the importance of tolerance. And the only way to defend that position is to say that tolerance is universally valuable and not just valuable relativistically.